Well, good morning, church family and friends. Today is the 13th day of October in the year of our Lord 2024. And welcome to everyone here at the building, Mountain View Church of Christ, 1080 East LaSalle Street here in sunny, fall-like Colorado Springs, Colorado. And welcome to everyone who has turned on their Zoom channel, and also you can see the class and the sermons on YouTube as well. Active Faith, that's the title of today's lesson. Elijah and the widow of Zarephath. Try and say that 10 times. It's interesting that there are 3 or 4 passages that talk about widows who made a difference, or widows who had great faith, widows who were depending on God for taking care of them. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord, will provide. Elijah is one of those oral prophets, like Elisha, his successor. They didn't write their history. It's found in the book of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, if you're going to be following Elisha. Originally, that was one book. Like Ezra and Nehemiah was meant to be one book. 1st and 2nd Chronicles was originally one book. Active faith. Is your faith active? Hopefully, yes. That you are alive and well, you're living by faith. Oddly enough, I'm just giving you a heads up. The sermon today is going to be about a widow who just wouldn't quit. She kept coming and coming and coming for a request to, shall we say, a rather intemperate judge. But that's a heads up. Act on your faith. Oddly enough, the passage that we're going to be studying, which is Luke, 1 Kings 17, 8 through 16, actually there's more to the story than just stopping there at verse 16. If you go on to the around about verse 24, it sort of gives us closure on why Elijah was sent to meet with the widow of Zarephath. And in 2 Kings 4, Elisha also does something for a widow, and the oil kept flowing. She got as many empty vessels as possible because there was a death in the family. She became a widow, and the debts were mounting up and up. And here Elisha comes along and helps her to solve the problem. So, what is the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath? Who is she? We'll try and dig into that a little bit. Jesus mentions her in Luke chapter 4, around about, I think, verse 26. Why was Elijah not sent to the widows of Israel, but he was sent to the widow of Zarephath, who represented, shall we say, the non-Jewish element? So here on the map, this is you can't see it very well, at least I can't. Does that show up on the screen behind me? Yeah. There it is, Zarephath. That's the modern name today. And Elijah's down here at the brook of Cherith, and it's about 60 miles. He has to get up there. Zarephath is part of the Sidonian Empire. Jezebel. You ever heard of Jezebel? Yeah, nobody names their children or their women Jezebel, or at least I don't think they do. So let's go to that next slide and you can see it a little bit better. This is showing Phoenicia. You've heard of the Syro-Phoenician woman in Luke, I think it's chapter 21. Zarephath is an odd place to go, because if you're trying to get away from people like Ahab and Jezebel, you certainly don't pick Sidonia. You don't pick going into the Sidonians' territory, because that's where Jezebel's grew up as a kid. So let's do a little bit of introduction here. Today's lesson is going to show us how God makes available incentives for obedience to him. What happens when you trust God? One of the key back passages or chapters is Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 5. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will straighten out your paths." He will keep your pathway straight. So the literary context is 1st and 2nd Kings. They were originally one book, as I said. And then C is the historical context. We're looking at a time around 890, 897 BC. This is when Ahab was king of Israel. I don't think, Bev, there were any good kings of Israel. They were all bad uns. And if you want to see who might be at the top of the list, I'd put Ahab right up at the top, and his wife Jezebel. And they were into sacrificing their own children, small babies, young men and women. So let's do a little bit of, we're not going to get into the text right away, because I want us to read about what happened before that in order to get where we're going today. So we'll start out with King Ahab and Elijah, the prophet of God. He was also called the prophet of fire. Any ideas why he was called the fire prophet? Remember on the mountain, and God's fire consumes the sacrifice, but also consumes the false prophets of Baal and also all of their stuff. And they were shouting up into the air, and Elijah said, "Shout a little longer. I don't think your God can hear you." And but you know what's interesting about a study on Elijah was he was subject to moods. He suffered from depression. And we hear of him hiding out in a cave because Jezebel has made his life a literal hell. And God tries to calm him down. So the northern kingdom of Israel was never had a single good king. All of them were bad. His wickedness was only increased by his wife, Queen Jezebel, who encouraged him in everything evil possible. So Elijah the prophet it was precisely during some dire times a famine, a drought takes place. There's a shortage of water, but let me tell you, there will be no shortage of water for Ahab and Jezebel. They have all that they need and more, but everyone else is suffering. He was perhaps the most influential prophet of them all. I'm talking about Elijah. There are two qualities of Elijah that stand out to me. One is his courage and his commitment to prayer. So really talking about his faith. In especially challenging times, I believe God raises up courageous and faithful, steadfast people to serve him in a time of crisis. And this is an engraving of Elijah praying for rain. Elijah tells Ahab there'll be no more rain, and the no more rain lasted for 3.5 years. No rain. And he's going into drought territory. So let's talk about Jezebel for a minute. Ahab and Jezebel, they were a pair. Ahab was ungodly. He and his wife actively sponsored the worship of Baal, a Canaanite god of fertility and rain. So they probably did a lot of rain dancing or had others do the rain dance. But they were cruel, they were ruthless, and they were totally consumed with evil because they became evil itself. Elijah and the king and Jezebel. Elijah was this true prophet of God. He appeared at especially a hard time in Israel's history. It reveals that through Israel, although they had departed from God, God had never departed from them. You know, that's I will never leave you, nor will I forsake you, comes to mind. God keeps, he honors, he has love for his children, even when his children are as evil as the northern part of Israel. What was the mission? Elijah's mission is to prove to Israel that the Lord is the one true God and there's no one else. The Lord is ultimately responsible for the nation's well-being. Before we get into our text, something odd happens. There's this drought. There's no food. So how does God provide food for Elijah to eat? The ravens come and they feed him. You know, ravens are a bird, a carrion kind of bird. They pick up roadkill as well. I'm wondering, what were they feeding Elijah? You never know. But he's kept alive. And again, what it does, it shows to Elijah that God provides. And the ravens keep him alive. There is water, there is something to eat. And it's not just the ravens he thanks. He needs to thank God. And there is a connection now to where we're going in our text. So let me just go back there a moment. God sends Elijah to a widow in the region of Sidon, or it could be spelt with a Z or a Z. It was the epicenter of Baal worship. It was also Jezebel's home territory where her father was the king. Now, there's the reference, if you want to check it out yourself, where Jesus says, "Why was Elijah sent not to the widows of Israel, the people of Israel, but was sent to a widow in Zarephath?" How old she was, we're not really sure. But I will say this, she seems to have a child that is of a young age, a son. And sadly, that son will become ill and die. But that's not in the verses that we'll be studying, but I think we need to read the rest of the story, don't you? Like Paul Harvey used to say. So Jesus used this story as an example of God reaching out to the world when his people were rejecting him. So, 3 things. God took care of the prophet through the widow. God took care of the widow through the prophet. And God will take care of all of us as we care for one another. So, in verse 21, which we will not study, but I feel a need to mention it, Elijah prays this bold prayer, but he still had to pray 3 times before the child's life was restored. He lays on him 3 times. And as a connector, Jesus raises a widow's son in Luke 7, verses 11 to 17. And it's only then when, at the end of verse 24 of 1 Kings chapter 17, that she will say, "Now I know that you are truly God's servant." Now, in especially challenging times, God always raises up courageous and faithful people to serve him. And the 21st century should be no stranger to that. Who knows what is yet to be? So, the text that we read just doesn't make sense. In today's lesson, there's 2 people originally who obeyed God even though it didn't seem to make sense for them to do so. For the one part is God sends Elijah to someone he doesn't know. God has already commanded or directed the widow at Zarephath to take care of the prophet Elijah. How was that done? Did she hear his voice? Did God come in a theophany? We're really not sure, but I'm going to read the text, and we'll be going down through verse 16, starting at verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there," or I think the NIV says, "I have directed a widow there to feed you." We're in a famine. We're in a drought. So he arose and he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gates of the city, behold, a widow was gathering sticks. It's sort of like, do you remember when the disciples were to go and make preparations for the Passover, the last Passover? Jesus says, you will meet a man who will be carrying a large jar of water. Follow him, and he will show you where to make preparations. Don't question it. Believe it. Isn't that part of faith? Don't be a Missourian, show me first. Act on faith. So, a widow will be there gathering sticks, and he called to her, "Bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink." Remember the woman at the well? She happened to be a non-Jew, and she happened to be a Samaritan. She happened to be a divorcee, not just 5 times, but 6 times. And the man that she was living with, that was not officially her husband. And Jesus asked her to give him some water. And of course, we know the rest of the story. But here he says, "And as she was going to bring it, he called to her again." This guy, what else does he want? A little water? She's bringing him the water. "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." And she says, "As the Lord your God lives," not "as the Lord my God lives," but "as the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked. Only all I've got is a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug." So then it turns out to be a cooking show, right? And now she wants to let him know. "And now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and then die." Because this is their last meal. Remember the widow's mite? The 2 coins that was her daily allowance? Where'd she put it? Did she go buy bread with it? No, she put it in to the contribution. She was leaning in on God. She was depending on God to provide. So, "I'm gathering a couple of sticks. I'm going to make a fire, then go in and prepare it for myself, so that we may eat the last of the flour and the oil, and then we're going to die." And Elijah said to her, "Do not be afraid, do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first, make me a little cake of it." What? "Make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. Bring me a little water and bring me some of the stuff that you're fixing for you and your son, and I want you to feed me first." "And then make something for yourself and your son. Me first, then you and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends the rain upon the earth." And she went in and did as Elijah had said. And she and her household ate for many days. And the jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. Interesting. Would you have that kind of faith to feed some stranger you don't know? When you and your son are, it's not you're going to be tucking into a big meal. It's some flour, a little bit of flour, that's all that's left. They've been eking it out every day, and a little bit of oil in a jug. And make something for a stranger. And then say, well, what's left? There'll be nothing left. No. He says, and then make something for you and yourself, you and your son. And she does it, and it just doesn't make sense. You know, God loves to do stuff that doesn't make the world sense. of rationality. So the prophet Elijah is sent to Zarephath. The Lord makes a command, and the command is simple. Elijah, you have to go to Zarephath, to Sidon. Oh, and by the way, you know that's where Jezebel is from. You know, he's going to be hiding in plain sight. He's not going to be going to the palace. He is going to a little place, a little village, where there is a widow. We don't know if she's all that old or all that young, but generally back in those days, when you were a widow, you sort of indicated by the type of garb you would wear. You've seen that in the Middle East. Women who are widows wear black a lot. And so there is this command. Then Elijah complies. He goes. He meets her at the gate. The setting, today's story is set in the northern kingdom of Israel. What happened to Israel after the death of Solomon? It was divided. And it wasn't like 6 tribes and 6 tribes. It was 10 tribes and 2 tribes left over. The 2 that was left over became known as Judah. The 10 tribes in the north were all were served by kings who were so evil, and they were led into idolatry. And it's not to say that Judah would not be led into idolatry, but there was greater hope for them than it was for the 10 tribes. What happened to the 10 tribes? We really don't know. They were absorbed or they died off. We really don't know. This is 874 to 853 BC. Instead of trusting God, Ahab cements a political alliance with the Sidonians by marrying Jezebel, a pagan and a totally wicked woman to boot. Jezebel turned her heart to the Canaanite god. By the way, when she died, she was thrown out of the top of a very tall place and crashing to the ground. And it says, moreover, the dogs refused, wouldn't even eat the flesh on the palms of her hands. That's how to indicate how evil a person she was. Jezebel turned his heart to the Canaanite god Baal and away from the Lord. Now, Ahab in turn promotes Baal worship in the northern kingdom by constructing an altar in his honor. By the way, if you want to understand about Solomon and all his wives, he had an Egyptian princess. And what did he do for her in Jerusalem? He built a palace and a place of worship for her to worship Egyptian deities. I don't think that went down too well with God, do you? 1 Kings 17 opens with Elijah defying King Ahab's chosen deity Baal, who was thought to control the dew and the rain. And so to make a point, the rain fails to show up. There is a drought, the crops fail, there is very little food in the nation, in the countryside, and people begin to die. To show the foolishness of following Baal, Elijah invoked God's name, declared there would be no more rain until the Lord said there would be. We who live in the plains of Colorado know how important every drop of rain is. You know, and it's getting to a point where water is scarce, isn't it? And we depend on rainfall. We depend on, like the Colorado River, to help farmers on either side of its banks. It Goes all the way through several places, different states. So, more of the setting. For a while, the Lord provided for Elijah by feeding him with whatever the ravens were bringing him. I don't think the ravens were going down into the local McDonald's and stealing a few hamburger rolls or whatever. God was feeding him, and let's put it this way, you don't turn up what God says. Remember what God said about the Gentiles and the vision of Peter, and everything in the sheet that Peter saw was bokeh. It was verboten. It was a food that many Jews, if not all Jews, considered as being unclean. And then God says, don't you dare call something unclean that which I have made clean. And he was about to prove that point in the conversion of the story of the man called Cornelius and his household. Sometime during the 3.5-year period, the brooks dried up and Elijah lost his source of drinking water, hence why he has to go to Zarephath. So that brings us to the text today. Surprise, surprise, and surprise. So, 1 Kings 17, 8 through 10, the first part of 10, indicates what is surprising about what happened. Let's just go back to that text. Let's go back to verses 8 through 10. Then the word of the Lord came to him, I want you to go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there, live there, stay there. And behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. Not just feed, but give him lodging. And so he arose and he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. How did he know that it would be that widow? Did she have a hello, my name is, I am the widow of Zarephath? I don't think so. But there's been enough said, and God makes it known. This is her. So she's gathering up sticks at the gate of the city. Behold, he calls to her and he says, bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink. If somebody knocked on your door and just said, Sylvia, bring me a glass of water, please. And water's in short supply at your house. You don't know this guy from Adam. You don't know who he is, and we don't know anymore from the conversation because this is what we get, and we have to work with what we get. Behold, bring me water in a vessel that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, without question, she turned. Think about hospitality in the time of Jesus. Think about hospitality in that part of the world, in the Middle East. Hospitality is a very important part, especially to entertain strangers, people who are traveling, sojourning. And so, and as she was going to bring it, he called to her. That was a surprise. He's a Jew. He's Jewish. He's a prophet of God. And let's just give this point that I don't think she's Jewish. Why do I think that? Because of something that Jesus said. She's not a widow from Israel. She is a widow, a foreign widow. But she goes ahead, turns around, gets some water, and hands it to him. So the Lord tells Elijah to do this. He goes. He obeys God. That's good. What was the surprise? The surprise was this. Instead of caring for Elijah in Israel, God decides to send him to a foreign land that happens to be in Jezebel's backyard, her homeland. That's weird. That doesn't make any sense. Doesn't that bring Elijah closer to Jezebel? Closer to Ahab? Closer to his enemies? What a surprise. Surprise, 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 number 2. So, the Lord has commanded the widow to take care of Elijah. Elijah has to go to Zarephath to meet her, and he makes some demands of her. Bring me water. So the Lord has commanded the widow. How does the Lord contact a widow in Zarephath that we have assumed? Let's just say, how did God contact Abraham? There was no texting back in those days. There was no email. There was no phone calls. Sometimes God appeared as an angel, the angel of the Lord. He would show up in a bush. How did he appear to Abraham? Was it just a voice? We don't know. Although on the plains of Mamre, men appear, and one of those men he calls the Lord. That is a theophany or a Christophany. So, the Lord commanded the widow to take care of Elijah. Does she believe in God? Well, if she didn't believe in God, would she have done this? She has to believe in God. And you know, a lot of times God takes people who are generally assumed to be non-believers, but the story shows up that they have greater faith. They have a trust in God. So, he commands the widow to take care of Elijah. The surprise is the widows were notoriously poor. Have you ever heard of the term kinsman redeemer? Kinsman redeemer. We encountered that with Ruth and Naomi, who happened to be, by the way, widows. And Ruth wants to care for her mother-in-law. So, back in those days, if there was no one else at home, they were destitute. They were out on the street. They lived in rather poor, squalid conditions because they didn't have any income coming in. Her little son is too young to work, and he is perhaps already ill. We're talking about the widow of Zarephath. So, how can we discern whether a seemingly unattractive opportunity might be God's opening a door for our protection or for us to receive a blessing? How do we determine that? How do we determine what the good and perfect will of God is? Well, Romans 12 says you got to be in the right frame of mind, and you've got to be able to say, present yourself to God as a living sacrifice. Any thoughts? Any observations? How do you determine whether this is an opportunity for your protection or for a blessing that comes from God, not just from somebody showing up at your door.
Well, I think if we're if we're in a good prayer life with God, He just gives us that inner nudge through the Spirit that tells us we should be doing that. That's what I think.
Sometimes God gently nudges us, and sometimes God just plain shoves us. So, how do you determine if such an opportunity is an optional one for you, or something that you can either accept or reject versus it being a divine directive from God? God has put you here for this. It's really summed up in one word: faith. We walk by faith, not by sight. So, let's read a little further. We've already done that, but that's okay. He says, bring me a little water, verse 10, that's part B. After she was going to bring it, he called her back, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. And she says, as the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. That's how bad it was. So, there was Elijah's request. Here is the widow's response. Now, surprise, surprise, surprise. We've read the rest of the verses. Elijah asks for water. The surprise is she complies even though water is so scarce because of the drought. Surprise, 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 some more. Elijah also asks for some bread. She has nothing baked. It's not like she can open the freezer and take out a loaf of bread and shove it in the microwave to thaw it out. She has nothing baked. And if she can make something, it's only for 2 people. And do you think about most mothers? The mother would do what for her child? Feed the child, give her portion to the son. That's the nature of mothers, especially, that we know of. He asked for that piece of bread, and the surprise is the widow only has enough to make one last meal, if you could call it a meal. If you take oil and flour and a scarce amount of a little bit of water, it makes a dough, right? You come up with a little bit of maybe unleavened bread. I don't know if it's no yeast in it, but it is not going to be, oh, that bread smells great. It's very small. Feed me first. So, what do you think? How can we challenge those who don't believe that they are able to give more so that they may be blessed and do more than they actually realize? How do we do that? Through what? By example, by encouragement. Digging in a little bit deeper in what context of the question above, would it be appropriate or inappropriate to point out this account of the poor widow? Should Elijah have said, no, don't fix me anything. You guys go ahead, and I'll be here for the funeral? No. This is all about faith. This is about listening to God. Elijah listens and goes. And then he makes two requests that are off the wall. She's nothing baked. There's very little in the larder. A bit of flour and a little bit of oil. But something miraculous happens. When you believe, when you have faith, when you let go and let God, God takes care of us. Even from some wild places. Let me tell you about a TV I got at a thrift store a long time ago. It was a color TV, but it had the old-fashioned tubes in it. And I found out that one of the tubes was defective, so the TV looked green all the time. Everybody was green. And the picture just was all over the place. So I go back to the thrift store. The guy says, I happen to have some valves. And then find out there's no sound. So I get another TV to put on top of it. So I can hear the sound and watch the action. Now, I'm going to end on this. There was a lady at Kimberling City who was a Roman Catholic nun. Sister Macca was her name, M-A-C-C-A. She heard about the preacher who bought 2 TVs, and she comes up to me and she says, I've got a TV. I said, oh no. I'm thinking of 3 TVs now. And she says, but I don't have a remote. And she brings over to our house this TV. It was beautiful, practically new, but no controller. So I go to Montgomery Ward's in Springfield looking for a remote control. And the guy behind the desk says, you know something, Mr. Shields? There's a guy in here who has a spare remote and he wants to give it to somebody. And it just so happens it's for that TV the nun gave you. So I get back, I'm almost done. I get the remote. It works fine. I got rid of the other sets. And then later on, lightning strikes it. But the remote control came from an unusual source as well. No, I'm not going to say the Pope of Rome. One of my elders got a call from Montgomery Ward saying there was a guy in looking for a remote. I heard you called and you said you had 2 for the same TV and only needed 1. And then it was after that that the TV got hit by lightning. We'll stop there. Next week, it'll be the faith of a centurion out of the Gospels. Thank you.